Welcome to a little trip to Paris. In a video earlier this year, I explained how COVID put a stop to my plans of being a travel guide with a local travel agency. I hadn't heard from them in over a year when suddenly I received a phone call. "Could you go to Paris for us?" they asked, with 44 guests on a bus next week. So, I'm in Paris, which you know already because you've clicked this, and I didn't know I was going to be in Paris a week ago. I'll fill you in on the details in the video. I'm sitting down by the Seine, and we've been on the road since yesterday morning, very early. Here comes a boat, so probably you won't be able to hear me. A so-called bateau mouche. I asked if I could sleep on it, and the next day I said I would go. Not without trepidation, but still, it was Paris. Already that first evening, after we'd arrived at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon at our hotel, I had to introduce the guests to the Paris metro system. We took the metro to the Latin Quarter near Notre Dame, and then they had about 2 hours to wander around and get some dinner. They wanted to meet again at 9 o'clock to go back together, so no early night for me. Alone at last. I've ordered a galette, a glass of Chardonnay, a little salad, and I've got the next hour to myself. Bon appétit. A galette is a savory version of a crêpe, the sweet pancake that is usually filled with chocolate sauce or similar. My galette had ham and cheese in it. The salad had a kind of mustard dressing on it, and it was all delicious. Not until I saw this clip again did I realize that I'd filmed some of the guests sitting at the sidewalk cafe behind me. I hung about near the Seine until 9 o'clock and heard many different languages spoken. The tourists were certainly back in Paris. Somebody just asked me directions in Spanish. I replied in French. They kept speaking in Spanish. This happened again only minutes later, and this time I replied in something resembling Spanish that the Latin Quarter was that way. Already I was getting a glimpse of the crazy traffic in Paris. The Parisians are fearless, and bicycle helmets are largely ignored. Everyone was back on the bus by 9 o'clock the next morning, and the day's program was a city tour including the Arc de Triomphe and La Défense. But many hours were dedicated to this tour, and the program didn't state anything more explicit than that until the evening. I had asked the driver, but he said he hadn't driven in Paris in years and didn't know the route, much to my surprise. I only just managed to text another driver back home, who graciously gave me a few more details, and then it was up to me to navigate through the streets of Paris. During the week leading up to the trip, I'd been alternating between planning and panicking. I was challenged to the max throughout the whole trip, building the bridge as I walked on it, as it were, but I tried to tell myself not to create a story about how difficult it was, and simply do the next thing needed, in every moment. You can go through a whole trip like that, it turned out. I filled the guests in on various historical details about Paris when I had a moment to look up from my map, such as the era of Enlightenment in the 18th century, which led to the French Revolution, both of which were important to not only French but world history. Briefly, the people of France had become increasingly poor and dissatisfied due to the king's increasing taxes, from which the nobility were exempt, and filled with new notions about the king not being a direct descendant from God, and from early ideas of democracy, they revolted. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were guillotined on the Place de la Concorde, along with hundreds of nobles, and by 1793, France made its first attempts at being a republic. We made a pit stop near the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées, the world's longest boulevard. The Arc itself is placed in the middle of the world's largest roundabout, which we drove round a few times. It can be tricky to be allowed to take the right exit because of the amount of traffic and the many lanes, which, by the way, are not marked. It's just cobblestones. You do not attempt to reach the Arc by crossing the roundabout, but go under it via a tunnel, which some of us did. Others headed for the Danish house on the Champs-Élysées to have a beer or coffee. The Arc is one of many monuments to the military exploits of Napoleon Bonaparte. Under it you can see the grave of the unknown soldier, a symbol of the 1.3 million French soldiers who died during World War I. Several of the 12 boulevards that begin at the roundabout are named after some of Napoleon's victories, as well as after important generals. Yet another sign of France's military pride, something that seems a bit at odds with the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity from the French Revolution. But I suppose all nations, like all people, are full of contradictions, which makes them all the more interesting. I've always wondered why there is a Danish house on the Champs-Élysées. The flags are conspicuous from far away, and you can buy Danish design in the shop on the ground floor. The Champs-Élysées begins at the Louvre and ends at the Arc de Triomphe, and is known for expensive shops, the final stage of the Tour de France, and an extravagant military parade on the 14th of July, the celebration of the storming of the Bastille back in 1789. I saw it once when François Mitterrand was president, and it was impressive. Then we drove out to La Défense, the most modern part of the city, which is in large part a business district, and which, to many, is not really Paris at all. I would concur. It is more interesting than beautiful. But it was the only place where, for 2 hours, I almost exclusively heard French spoken, not various other languages spoken by tourists. Because many French people work here, and it is worth a visit, if for no other reason than to appreciate the more classic version of Paris once you return to it. The main attraction of La Défense is the modern arch in the very middle, known as La Grande Arche. It's 110 meters high, or 360 feet, which means the Notre Dame could actually stand underneath it. It's surprisingly huge once you sit under it. It was designed by a Danish architect named Otto von Spreckelsen in 1984, and is a monument to humanitarian ideals, rather than military victories. So another pit stop. This time a double macchiato and a double chocolate chip cookie. And it being Starbucks, I had to tell them my name, or a name. So I'm now Hélène, because Helle or Hille is impossible for the French to pronounce. It completes the historical axis that runs through Paris, from the glass pyramid in front of the Louvre, through the obelisk on the Place de la Concorde, up to the Arc de Triomphe, and which then ends in La Défense. As I mentioned to the guests on the bus, I will never tire of looking at the beautiful cream-colored buildings, with their stucco details, wrought iron balconies, and grey slate roofs. They are Paris to me. We drove back to the hotel for a brief pit stop, and were back on the bus again an hour and a half later, this time for an evening tour which began at a restaurant near the opera. Again, I had to find it on a map and make sure that we got there on time, plus pay the bill in time to get to our next stop on time. All this while trying to appear calm and collected in front of the guests, and speak French with more confidence than I really felt. When we left the restaurant, it had begun raining and my heart sank. We were heading to the Seine to catch a bateau mouche some 20 minutes later, and the best way to do that is by sitting outside so you can see the whole city glide past you. As we drove around the Place de la Concorde again, I tried to make light of it. Ladies and gentlemen, Champs-Élysées, in the rain. Champs-Élysées, til højre. Lige regnvejr. But I could see the mist gathering, making it difficult to see anything at all. I felt illogically responsible for the weather. But lo and behold, the weather gods seemed to be on our side, because only minutes later, the skies cleared and we saw the Eiffel Tower. Our gratitude, or my gratitude and their relief, was that much greater because of the rain just over. For once, I could just sit back and enjoy the boat trip because someone else would be telling us all about the buildings and the bridges in several languages. My gratitude doubled. It was getting darker, and the city put on all its lights. Previously, I had told the guests why Paris is called the City of Lights. There are two reasons, it turns out. One is that it was one of the first cities to have street lights, thanks to Louis XIV, who had them installed to make Paris safer back in the 17th century. The other reason is the more metaphorical light in the 18th century, the Enlightenment, as I previously mentioned, with men like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Diderot paving the way for the advent of logic and science and education instead of religion and superstition. We sailed around one of the two islands in the Seine, Ile Saint-Louis, which has some of the most expensive addresses in Paris. You may remember that the roof of the Notre Dame burned in 2019, and donations to renovate the cathedral poured in from all over the world. President Macron has declared that he wants the renovations to be finished for the 2024 Paris Olympics, but experts have said that for a church that took 182 years to build, restoring it in 5 is beyond unrealistic. The Eiffel Tower put on a magnificent show. The tower, by the way, is named after the man who designed it for the World Exhibition in 1889, Gustave Eiffel, and it marked the centenary of the French Revolution. It was supposed to be temporary, but who can imagine Paris without it today? It took 300 men 2 years to build it, and in the year 2000, it took 25 mountain climbers 5 months to attach 20,000 light bulbs to it, which light up for 5 minutes once every hour at night. We were overtaken by some black cars with a police escort. Considering that the home of the president was close by, we theorized that maybe he was the very important passenger in one of those cars. Shortly afterward, we drove across what has been voted the most beautiful bridge in the world, the Alexander III Bridge, with the dome of Les Invalides in the background, final resting place of Napoleon. The next day, sighting a charming-looking man on the sidewalk, a man one would never see on any street in Denmark, as well as a businessman sprinting by, I urged the guests to look at people in Paris as much as they looked at beautiful buildings. We'd already been looking at traffic behavior, and the driver said multiple times that that was the last time he drove a bus through Paris, a bus that is a few meters longer than other buses, incidentally. We were heading back to the Opera House, or the Palais Garnier, named after the architect behind it, this time to enter it and see the splendid interior. It was built in 1860 and was the original setting for The Phantom of the Opera, a novel written by Gaston Leroux in 1910, about a disfigured musical genius who haunts the opera house. It's a gorgeous building, and I had never been inside it before. The French artist Marc Chagall has created the ceiling inside the theater itself, but unfortunately it was closed for rehearsals that day. But the rest of the opera house was stunning, and I walked around, taking in the splendor. It reminded me of Versailles, the royal palace just outside Paris, where we were going a few days later. After leaving the opera house, I went to the Galerie Lafayette, which I had also suggested that the guests take in, partly because it's the most luxurious and well-known department store in Paris, partly because of the gorgeous glass dome, and partly because of the view of Paris from the roof. Afterwards, we headed for Montmartre, the hilly, bohème part of Paris typically inhabited by artists, but made a little detour so they could see the Moulin Rouge. The obvious first destination on Montmartre is the Sacré-Cœur, the white church at the top of the hill that overlooks Paris and which was built between 1875 and 1919 to atone for sins accumulated in various uprisings during the 1800s. I saw a sign that said Jardin Caché, Hidden Garden, and since the guests had an hour and a half on their own, I made my way to that hidden courtyard where I indulged a bit and began preparing for our visit to Versailles. I wrapped up the meal with an espresso and a tiramisu, and the whole meal and the quiet was just what the doctor ordered for this travel guide. Thus refreshed and re-energized, I took in Montmartre, former hangout place for artists like Toulouse-Lautrec, Van Gogh, Renoir, and also writers like Hemingway, who lived in Paris in the 1920s. The 1920s in Paris were known as les années folles, the crazy years, during which the city became a magnet for artists and writers. Maybe you've seen the wonderful movie Midnight in Paris, which is a trip to that particular time. The place is extremely touristy, but so is all of Paris. It's the most visited city in the world, with some 30 million visitors a year. This particular café, Le Consulat, as the plaque on the wall will tell you, was where many of the greatest artists used to meet up. Strangely, there is a Danish flag on the facade. I walked around a bit in the shade because it was boiling, and saw a woman in a park knitting with her dog beside her. Then I went to sit in the church for a little while, partly to pay my respects, but mainly to cool off. A man working there kept shushing the noisy tourist, his shushing being quite a bit louder than their whispers. Then I sat in the shade for a while until we were all to meet up again back at the bus. Leaving Montmartre, all the guests accounted for, we crossed the Place de la République, then the Place de la Bastille, again with the newer Bastille Opera House, and then back to our hotel, where I collapsed. I'll leave you with a sneak peek of part 2 of the Paris videos and hope that you'll join me then. À bientôt et merci!